excited to welcome Dr. Daniel Lee. He's a research assistant professor at the University of Michigan Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention. His overarching research goal is to inform the development of firearm injury prevention programs that address the multifaceted downstream consequences of structural racism, and particularly among racially marginalized youth. And despite the widening racial disparities in gun violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been very limited research on racism as a structural driver of gun violence. But Dan has been really digging into the literature that does exist to share what we know about this topic, what we still don't know, and next steps to really inform a more effective intervention. So excited to have you, Dan. And without further ado, I'll let you get started and share. Yeah. Okay, and let me know if you need anything.
Yeah, let me see if I can share. I could share screen. Great. Okay, perfect. What is that, screen 2? I never. All right. What do folks see? I should always. Oh, Lainey, you're
slide. It's looking good. We can see your slides, so perfect.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, hi everyone. Lainey introduced me as Dr. Daniel Lee, but folks can feel free just to call me Dan. I'm a research assistant prof at the University of Michigan's Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention. And I'm really happy to talk about a scoping review project that my colleagues and I are working on to synthesize, summarize and synthesize, I guess, the emerging body of evidence pertaining to racism and racial disparities in firearm violence. So I'll start by presenting the objectives of our study and our scoping review and the background research that informs our study. I'll then talk about some of the methods that went into identifying and selecting the articles for our scoping review. And then I'll summarize some of the key findings from our scoping review and discuss some opportunities for advancing our understanding of this link between racism and firearm violence. So before I present the study objectives, I wanted to provide a quick overview of what a scoping review is, since I'll be using this term a lot today. And so the overarching purpose of a scoping review is to really summarize an emerging body of evidence related to a topic area and to provide some guidance on how that area of research should evolve. Scoping reviews may also call attention to the various ways that terminologies and concepts have been used. So, for example, like racism, and scoping reviews can be helpful for clarifying and remedying some of these conceptual differences. And scoping reviews are also useful for learning about how research has been conducted in a topic area, and also for measuring the quality of those methodologies. And then lastly here, researchers also may use scoping reviews to identify factors that are related to an outcome of interest. So for instance, Lainey and I and a few others, we published a scoping review a few years back to catalog some of the risk and the protective factors associated with youth firearm violence. So these are some of the objectives of scoping review. So for our scoping review, our first objective is to summarize the findings from studies that examined racism and racial disparities in firearm violence. Our second objective is to identify various theoretical models and research methodologies that have been used across these different studies. And our third objective is to identify knowledge gaps and inform future research opportunities. So I'll now talk about some of the background research that informed our scoping review. So firearm violence is a national public health issue. And in 2020, nearly 45,000 people in the US prematurely died as a result of firearm violence. Now, firearm violence is multifaceted, and it can include different forms of violence like suicides and homicides and legal interventions like police shootings. Now, while all forms of firearm violence are significant public health issues, we narrowed our scoping review to examine interpersonal forms of firearm violence like firearm homicides and non-fatal firearm assault injuries, as well as police firearm violence, such as fatal and non-fatal police shootings. And we narrowed our scope and review in this way since interpersonal and police firearm violence often it involves injuring or taking the life of another person, whereas firearm suicide involves taking one's own life. And so these different facets of violence may operate via different mechanisms. Now, like many public health issues in the US, racial and ethnic disparities in firearm homicides have been consistently documented. As shown in this bar plot, in 2020, non-Hispanic Blacks in the US were approximately 12 times more likely than non-Hispanic whites to die as a result of firearm homicides. Disparities between American Indians and whites and Hispanics and whites have also been consistently documented. And when we look at these disparities over time, we can see that for nearly 2 decades, firearm homicide rates for Blacks, American Indians, and Hispanics were higher than firearm homicide rates for whites. And in addition, from 2018 to 2020, maybe in part due to COVID-19, there was this gradual rise, this increase in racial disparities in firearm homicide rates, suggesting really just a lack of improvement in these disparities. So when we look at firearm homicide rates over the life course by race, we can also see that racial disparities are pervasive from early life to old age. However, what really caught my attention when I looked at this figure was the sudden and very drastic emergence of racial disparities in firearm homicides from ages 15 to 19. So, you know, when thinking about firearm injury prevention, I think it's really crucial that we don't overlook youth, since early life experiences may play a very important role in shaping racial disparities in firearm violence during adolescence and maybe even later in life. And so later on in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the advantages of adopting a life course perspective when studying racial disparities, especially in firearm violence. So racial disparities in firearm violence is also pervasive across like the entire US, right? So to compute the magnitude of Black-white disparities in firearm homicide rate at the state level, we divided the age-adjusted rate of firearm homicides for Blacks by the age-adjusted rates of firearm homicide for whites. And so if the disparity ratio is larger than 1, this would indicate that Blacks are more likely to die as a result of firearm homicide relative to whites within a particular state. And if you look at the numeric values kind of across the different states here, pretty much the ratio is all larger than 1. Now, with exception to the gray states, which is where racially disaggregated data was unreliable or unavailable, Black-white disparities in firearm homicides appear to be more pronounced in states located in the Midwest and the Northeast region of the United States relative to states in the Southeast region. And so to make sense of this, researchers noted that Southern states tend to have higher rates of firearm violence just across the board for both white and Blacks, which could then attenuate this Black-white disparity ratio. And other researchers have suggested that higher levels of residential racial segregation is predictive of Black-white disparities in interpersonal firearm violence, like firearm homicides. And so states in the Midwest and Northeast tend to have higher residential racial segregation scores than states in the Southeast. And so these state-level variations in residential racial segregation may explain some of the state-level variations in firearm homicides, as you see in this map. Okay, so when we look at non-fatal firearm assault injuries from 2001 to 2020, non-Hispanic Blacks accounted for approximately 50% of these injuries, even though they account for 13 to 14% of the US population in any given year from 2001 to 2020. And when we look at Black-white disparities in the rate of fatal police shootings from 2013 to 2023, so for the past decade, fatal police shooting rates are higher among Blacks than whites, and again, virtually every state. And much like the previous map that I showed, Black-white disparities and fatal police shootings may be higher in Midwestern and these northern states than southern states due to state-level variations in residential racial segregation. So some researchers have posited that explanation. And when we look at the number of fatal police shootings from 2013 to 2022, we see a slight declining trend over time. However, these counts still indicate that during the past 10 years, 1 or 2 Black individuals on average lost their lives each day due to police shootings. So when all of this is taken together, there's ample evidence of racial disparities in interpersonal and police firearm violence. And scholars, especially in diversity science, have posited that racism is a fundamental driver of racial health disparities, including racial disparities in firearm violence. And so the idea is that race is a manufactured social concept based on visible physical traits like skin color and facial features, and is a social concept that was essentially developed to design and enact racist policies and institutions and ideologies and behaviors that all work collectively to undermine the health and well-being of people from racially minoritized groups. Now, as a beginning point to studying racism, we need to think about how to conceptualize racism, right? So in Jones's seminal tripartite model of racism, he identified 3 subtypes. So first, individual racism in this model refers to individual level experiences of interpersonal racism, like being called a racial epithet or experiencing racial microaggressions. Institutional racism refers to discriminatory policies and practices within institutions like the criminal justice system that has adverse effects for people in racially minoritized groups. So an example of this would be racial disparities in sentencing decisions for the same drug offense. And lastly, cultural racism refers to perpetuating an intergenerational ideologies and worldviews that support the superiority of one racial group over another. And so an example of this includes the negative and stereotypic representation of people of color in the media. Another common racism-related concept is structural racism. So structural racism refers to the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing and equitable systems like racial discrimination in housing and the education system that can in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs and values and also the unfair distribution of resources. So to provide an example of structural racism, exclusionary zoning is a housing discrimination practice that prevents racial minorities from moving into well-resourced, higher opportunity neighborhoods by placing restrictions on the types of homes that can be built to ultimately make most of the homes in that the higher opportunity neighborhood more unaffordable. And so as a result of this practice, racial minority families may be pushed to neighborhoods that are more segregated, over-policed, have inadequate public services, that have polluted air, contaminated water, which are all different forms of inequitable systems that work in tandem and in lockstep to contribute to racial health disparities. So structural racism really focuses on the interlocking nature of the inequitable systems across multiple sectors of society. Now, researchers have developed a wide variety of theoretical models to conceptualize how racism might shape racial health disparities. So one model that I particularly like is the framework for the study of racism and health by Drs. David Williams and Muhammad. And this model posits that institutional and cultural racism are the most fundamental and upstream factors that contribute to racial health disparities. And this model also posits that institutional and cultural forms of racism can invoke socio-ecological consequences. like diminished socioeconomic opportunities in the community and fewer societal resources, like access to healthcare and affordable housing, which can in turn undermine minority health and perpetuate racial disparities. Additionally, this model posits that institutional and cultural racism can give rise to interpersonal forms of racism-related stressors and also other forms of stressors like exposure to community violence, which can undermine health by routinely dysregulating psychological and biological stress processes. So I share all this to illustrate that researchers really have been actively thinking about and conceptualizing the different ways by which racism may reinforce and sustain racial health disparities, again, including racial disparities in firearm violence. So with regard to the study of racism and firearm violence, there's been a gradual accumulation of studies since 2016 and onwards. Between 2001 and 2016, with exception to one study here in 2001, there's been an absence of published research examining the link between racism and firearm violence. And so really, by all accounts, this is an emerging area of research that is beginning to gain some traction and momentum. Okay, so just as a reminder here, to talk again just very quickly about the objectives of our scoping review, I'll summarize the emerging evidence related to the study of racism and racial disparities in firearm violence. I'll also explore some of the theoretical models and research methodologies used in this body of research. And then lastly, I'll use insights from the kind of key findings to inform future research directions. Now, before I present key findings, I wanted to provide a very quick overview of how we selected the articles for our scoping review. So we worked with a librarian at the University of Michigan to conduct this search, and the librarian searched for these studies in the following databases listed here. And many of the search terms were used to identify the articles. Many search terms are used. And now I won't, because of time here, I won't go through every single search term, but in general, our search terms, were related to firearms and firearm-related behaviors. Some of the terms, actually many of the terms are also related to racism-related concepts like discrimination, segregation, unfair treatment, stigma, prejudice, and really many more. To screen our identified studies, the following selection criteria was used. And again, I won't read through all of these, but the study had to examine a firearm-related outcome, but we were pretty broad about what that entails. So that could have been firearm purchasing, homicides, carriage, ownerships, and much more. The predictor variable had to be related to racism, and so we excluded studies that just examined racial differences, for a firearm outcome. We also selected peer-reviewed and empirical studies, and we excluded dissertations and conference papers, and we only selected articles that focused on firearm violence in the US. And all studies had to be published during 1990 or some point after that. So for the review process, 5 reviewers first conducted the title and abstract review. And so if the studies met the selection criteria, these studies were then advanced to a full text review, which was independently reviewed by 2 reviewers. Weekly meetings were held to discuss and reconcile discrepancies. So to provide a quick breakdown of the study identification and screening process, our initial pool of deduplicated studies consisted of 2,732 studies. However, 25 more studies were removed after a more manual deduplication process. And of the remaining 2,707 studies, 2,653 studies were excluded because they didn't meet our selection criteria. So we were then left with 54 studies, but we excluded another 37 studies. So 15 of those 37 studies were excluded because they focused on racial prejudice and more laboratory-based shooting simulations, and we were concerned that these studies may not necessarily generalize to racial disparities in firearm violence. 11 studies had the wrong outcome variable. So for instance, some studies merged firearm and non-firearm related outcomes together, and they didn't disentangle that in their analysis. So an example of that might be kind of a general weapon carriage. 8 studies examined racial differences, but they didn't assess racism. And 2 studies were non-empirical papers, and 2 studies were conference abstracts or conference papers. So after excluding those studies, we were left with 17 studies to review. Now, to summarize the findings and assess the quality of each study, 3 investigators and 2 research assistants split into 2 teams and were randomly assigned 8 or 9 articles. The abstraction consisted of summarizing the key characteristics of each article, including the study setting, the sample characteristics, the measurements used, and the relevant findings. Our quality assessment included whether the study presented a theoretical model that was relevant, the quality of the measures. So for instance, the number of racial or racism dimensions measured, the recency of the firearm data, the appropriateness of the study, design and analytic approach given the research question, whether the sample was generalizable to the study population, whether the results are correctly interpreted, and any other kind of methodological issues. So that was our quality assessment. And so each reviewer individually evaluated articles, and then a meeting was held to reach consensus. Okay, so now I'm gonna summarize some of the key findings across these 17 studies. So of the 17 studies reviewed, 13 focused on interpersonal firearm violence and 4 focused on police firearm violence, which includes mainly fatal police shootings. So I'll begin by talking about the 13 studies that focused on interpersonal firearm violence. And I'll start by talking about the theoretical models that were used. And so of the 13 studies, 6 studies did not invoke any theoretical models. The other 7 studies discussed 7 different theoretical models, with several studies discussing more than one model, which is why the count here, it doesn't add up to 7, it's higher than that. So, as shown in this table, the eco-social theory by Krieger was the most frequently cited theoretical model. And this wasn't that surprising to me, since this theory provides an overarching framework for researching social inequities in health. And so very quickly here, to give you a flavor for this popular model among the 13, the eco-social theory posits that racism can undermine health through various pathways, such as through economic and social deprivation, exposure to toxins and pathogens, and limited access to medical care. And there are other pathways delineated here. The model also emphasizes the importance of adopting a life course perspective and examining how these different pathways influence how health and well-being unfolds across a lifespan. And this model also stresses the importance of identifying pathways that exist across the, multiple levels. So starting from the individual level all the way up to the national and global level. Now, another trend I noticed is that half of the theoretical models emphasize the role of social structures and bonds and relationships and neighborhood characteristics, especially as it relates to crime. And many of these theoretical models emerge from criminology and sociology. So for instance, strain theory posits that individuals may experience frustration and emotional distress if they feel like they're unable to achieve positively valued goals, like going to college or getting a job, due to the consequences of structural racism. And so theorists have argued that these negative emotions and cognitions can in turn create the psychosocial conditions for engaging in crime. Social disorganization theory, on the other hand, really focuses on how neighborhood disadvantage, which could be byproduct of structural racism, weaken social networks and bonds between residents, how it could also lead to the breakdown of informal control mechanisms, how it could diminish collective efficacy, which in turn can create and really set the conditions for crime in a neighborhood. And so the key takeaway here is that researchers have leveraged different theoretical models to discuss potential psychological, social, and ecological mechanisms underlying the link between racism and firearm violence. So multiple measures were used to assess racism. Among the 13 studies, 6 examined residential racial segregation and utilized measures like the index of dissimilarity, interaction index, the index of concentration at the extremes. Now, the index of dissimilarity was by far the most popular and frequently used. And this metric essentially quantifies the degree to which 2 groups are unevenly distributed, and a score of 0 indicates complete integration, whereas a score of 100 reflects complete segregation. So it ranges from 0 to 100. 6 studies also examined historical redlining. And so during the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in short, we call it HOLC, was a government agency that assigned grades to neighborhoods to restrict mortgage lending and investments in communities that had an increasing concentration of, or a very high concentration of, racial minorities and immigrants. And to enact this discriminatory practice, lenders used red ink, and in some cases yellow ink, to draw boundaries around neighborhoods with an increasing or an elevated concentration of racially minoritized groups to restrict lending in these neighborhoods. Whereas blue and green ink was used to earmark neighborhoods that were predominantly white and that were deemed desirable for investment in mortgage lending. A few studies also computed Black-white inequalities and socioeconomic outcomes, and as well as Black-white inequalities and incarceration rates, and a disparity ratio was used to compute the magnitude of that inequality. And other researchers calculated racialized economic segregation to measure the joint impact of racial segregation and economic segregation. And so this score ranges from -1 to +1, with scores closer to -1, indicating a larger percentage of, or a larger proportion of low-income Black residents relative to high-income white residents in a particular a neighborhood or a census tract, whereas a score closer to +1 indicates a larger percentage of high-income whites relative to low-income Blacks in a particular spatial area. And lastly, researchers in one study used surveys to measure the respondents' experiences with interpersonal forms of racial discrimination and also cultural racism, as well as anticipatory racism-related stress. Which really measures psychological stress and the emotional toll that comes with anticipating and really psychologically bracing for a future racism encounter. So for interpersonal firearm violence outcomes, 6 of the 13 articles assessed shooting incidents that resulted in a fatal or a non-fatal firearm assault injury, and data sources here typically included police data, statewide public health surveillance systems, the Gun Violence Archive, and other place-based administrative data sets. The next frequently examined outcome was firearm homicides, and this outcome was measured using national public health surveillance systems like the CDC's National Vital Statistics System. Other studies calculated Black-white disparities and firearm homicide rates using CDC or FBI data. And lastly, one study used surveys to assess the respondents' firearm and ammunition purchasing, as well as firearm carriage and their intentions to purchase a firearm or more ammunition than usual during COVID-19. Now, with regards to study methodologies, 11 of the 13 studies used cross-sectional or time-lag cross-sectional design to examine associations between 5 measures of racism and 4 measures of interpersonal firearm violence. Of the 2 studies that used a longitudinal design, one study used a diff and diff approach, and another estimated growth mixture models of black-white disparities in firearm homicides. So they estimated these multiple and distinct trajectories of these black-white disparities in firearm homicide. It's also noteworthy to mention that 2 studies evaluated moderators, which are factors that can moderate or modify the association between 2 variables. So for instance, in one study, the strength of the association between historical redlining and firearm shooting incidents was attenuated at higher levels of Black income mobility. One study also identified mediators, which are variables that operate as kind of a intermediate pathway between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And so in the only study that looked at mediators, historical redlining influenced firearm shooting incidents via neighborhood socioeconomic outcomes. And I'll discuss this later in the presentation. Okay, now to summarize key findings and to start with redlining and interpersonal firearm violence, 5 studies detected an association between redlining and higher rates of firearm assaults and injuries, assaults and homicides. So in a study by Jacoby and colleagues, and I don't know if Doug Weeb is here, but he was a co-author on that paper, so shout out to him. Researchers found that census tracts that were redlined in the 1930s was associated with an 8-fold increase in the rate of firearm assaults during 2013 and 2014 relative to green line neighborhoods, which are, so as a reminder, green line neighborhoods are predominantly white neighborhoods that the HOLC deemed, as desirable and gave mortgage lending. Yellow line neighborhoods, which were neighborhoods that were classified as declining, and they weren't viewed as desirable for investment, was associated with a 7-fold increase in the rate of firearm assaults in 2013 and 2014 relative to green line neighborhoods. For residential racial segregation and interpersonal firearm violence, 4 studies documented that residential racial segregation was positively associated with non-fatal firearm assault injury and firearm homicide and black-white disparities in firearm homicide. And so in a study by Houghton and colleagues, higher levels of residential racial segregation was associated with higher rates of firearm homicides across the largest 51 metro areas that also had a Black population of 3% or greater. For racialized economic segregation and interpersonal firearm violence, 3 studies documented an association between racialized economic segregation and increased rates of firearm homicides and non-fatal firearm assaults. So in this study, Krieger and colleagues found that in the lowest quintile of racialized economic segregation, that was associated with a 3-fold increase in firearm homicides and a 5-fold increase in non-fatal firearm assaults relative to census tracts in the highest quintile of racialized economic segregation. So as a reminder of this, census tracts in the lowest quintile of racialized economic segregation had a much larger concentration of low-income Blacks than high-income whites, whereas census tracts in the highest quintile had a much larger concentration of high-income whites than low-income Blacks. For racial inequalities in socioeconomic outcomes and interpersonal firearm violence, Wong and colleagues observed that higher levels of Black-white disparities in poverty rate is associated with greater disparities in firearm homicide rates between Blacks and whites across 275 cities that had a population of greater than 100,000 people. And they detected this effect even after controlling for residential racial segregation, in addition to other city-level characteristics. And finally, shout out to Xin Fang, who is a co-author in this study. Wu and colleagues conducted a national survey of Asian Americans and documented that interpersonal racial discrimination and cultural racism and anticipatory racism-related stress were all associated with different types of firearm-related outcomes, including firearm purchasing, purchasing more ammunition than usual, firearm carriage, and the intention to purchase firearms and more ammunition than usual. So for instance, as depicted in the table here on the right side, higher levels of anticipatory racism-related stress was associated with greater intentions to purchase a firearm during COVID-19. Okay, so I'm going to transition now and talk about key findings related to racism and police firearm violence. And I'll start with the theoretical models again. So as a reminder, there were 4 studies that were reviewed, and theoretical models are presented they were present in 3 of the 4 studies. 2 studies discussed the 2 models that you see here, and 1 study discussed 1 of the models. So the first model is the community violence hypothesis, which essentially posits that racial disparities in police firearm violence exist due to higher rates of violent crime in Black communities. The second model, which is racial threat hypothesis, posits that police officers view highly segregated and predominantly Black neighborhoods as more threatening, in part due to their own racial bias, and are therefore more likely to respond with violence in these neighborhoods than in neighborhoods that are predominantly white or racially integrated. And so the key difference here is that racial threat hypothesis focuses on racism and the police officer's racial bias about Black communities, whereas community violence hypothesis really de-emphasizes racism and focuses more on the higher rates of crime in Black communities. And so in 2 of the 4 studies, researchers acknowledged that these 2 theories are competing theories, and they conducted their study and ran their analysis to essentially provide evidence for one theory over the other. So racism was measured in 2 ways across the 4 studies. First, in 2 studies, researchers assessed Black-white disparities in socioeconomic outcomes, and as well as Black-white disparities in incarceration rates using, again, those Black-white disparity ratios. Secondly, all 4 studies measured residential racial segregation, and they all used the index of dissimilarity. For police firearm violence outcomes, all 4 studies examined fatal police shootings. Specifically, 1 study measured the occurrence of fatal police shootings. I believe that was in census tracts. 2 studies assessed the number of fatal police shootings for racial and ethnic minority victims, and 2 studies measured Black-white disparities in fatal police shooting rates, again, using those Black-white disparity ratios. With respect to the data sources that were leveraged here, 3 studies used the Mapping Police Violence database, and 1 study used Washington Post's Fatal Force database. So the Fatal Force database by Washington Post focuses on fatal police shootings and relies primarily on news articles and social media posts, law enforcement agency data, if that's available, and other independent data sources like the Fatal Encounters database, which is another database for police shootings. The Mapping Police Violence database, on the other hand, takes a little bit of a more broader approach by documenting all fatalities resulting from police violence, including firearm violence as well as incidents involving the use of tasers and physical restraints and other mechanisms. And researchers can disaggregate the data by the type of violence. Now, like the Fatal Force database, the Mapping Police database uses news articles to document fatal police encounters, and researchers who work for this database reviews all the articles and extracts incident level information about the fatal police encounters, such as the race of the victim, as well as whether the victim was armed or unarmed, and how the victim died. And this data is then cross-checked with data from the Fatal Encounters database, as well as the Fatal Force database, and federal databases like CDC's National Vital Statistics System. So with regards to the analytic approach, all the studies use cross-sectional or time-lapse cross-sectional designs to evaluate associations between the two measures of racism and the three fatal police shooting outcomes. So to summarize findings for residential racial segregation and police firearm violence, 4 different studies documented that residential racial segregation is positively associated with overall fatal police shootings for ethnic and racial minority victims, and Black-white disparities in police shootings. So for example, here, Siegel and colleagues found that a 1 standard deviation increase in residential racial segregation was associated with a 44.4% increase in the Black to white disparity ratio for the fatal police shooting rate. And this is a study that was, the unit of analysis for this study was the 75 largest cities in the United States. Next, for Black-white socioeconomic inequalities and police firearm violence, 2 studies documented positive associations between Black-white socioeconomic inequalities and fatal police shootings, and as well as Black-white disparities in fatal police shootings. So Messick and colleagues here, they first actually constructed a composite state racism index by aggregating 5 racism measures, including residential racial segregation, Black-white disparities in employment outcomes, Black-white disparities in economic outcomes, Black-white disparities in incarceration rate, and Black-white disparities in educational attainment. And what they found was that this overall state racism index was associated with a larger Black to white ratio of fatal police shootings for unarmed victims. Now, among the 5 measures that comprised the state racism index, residential racial segregation, Black-white disparities in economic outcomes, and Black-white disparities in employment outcomes were associated with higher Black-white disparities in fatal police shootings, again, among unarmed victims. So the emerging body of work suggests that structural and institutional and cultural and interpersonal forms of racism may contribute to racial disparities in interpersonal and police firearm violence, but there is still, work to be done, and I see several opportunities here towards building knowledge about this connection between racism and racial disparities in firearm violence. So, as a beginning point, I think there is a need for a conceptual model, or as one of my colleagues put it, a grand conceptual model that unifies the various mechanisms that connect racism to racial disparities in firearm violence. And I think there's a need for this because a pretty significant proportion of studies, 7, I think, of the 17 studies that we reviewed, didn't situate their research questions or their analysis or their interpretation of results using theoretical models. So the theoretical models that we've cataloged in our scoping review, from Krieger's eco-social theory to the various theories from criminology and sociology, I think they all offer a beginning point and provide insights into some of the distinct and the multifaceted ways by which racism may reinforce racial disparities in firearm violence. So I think that there's a need for a framework that can unite the variety of these multi-level mechanisms to provide a guiding framework for the study of racism and racial disparities in firearm violence. In addition to theorizing these mechanisms, I also think it's important for researchers to theorize the role of protective factors as it relates to these various downstream consequences of racism. And so I think the conceptual model should also provide some guidance on how to select and evaluate protective factors to ultimately help inform, the development of firearm violence prevention programs that can promote resilience within the context of racism to reduce racial disparities in firearm violence. In addition to developing a conceptual model, I think there's a need to also empirically evaluate mediators and moderators to better understand the link between racism and firearm violence. Currently, of the 17 studies reviewed, only one study assessed mediators and 2 assessed moderators. And so mediators are, I think, a crucial piece to not only building knowledge about operative pathways from an exposure to an outcome, but mediators can also help identify points of intervention to address specific downstream processes from racism to firearm violence. So as an example of this, as shown in the figure on the left, socioeconomic outcomes in this study mediated the association between historical redlining and firearm shooting incidents. And so these researchers recommended that implementing economic reinvestment strategies in racially segregated and economically disinvested communities is really a crucial step towards disrupting and attenuating the enduring effects of historical redlining on firearm violence. And as I also mentioned already, protective factors could play an important role in policy and program development. And so, for instance, as delineated now here on the figure on the right side, researchers observed that increasing Black income mobility can significantly reduce disparities in firearm shooting incidents between red-lined and green-line neighborhoods. And so researchers in this study recommended the need for policies that can promote upward socioeconomic mobility for Black Americans and other folks from racially minoritized groups to address, again, this enduring effect of redlining on firearm violence. And so I think it's important to begin integrating more moderators and mediators into this body of work to better understand how racism shapes racial disparities in firearm violence. The third research opportunity here relates to measurements. So as mentioned already, racism is a multidimensional concept, yet in 7 of the studies that we reviewed, researchers utilized a single place-based measure of racism. And really in only one study, researchers assessed the different dimensions of racism, like interpersonal racial discrimination and cultural racism. So I think going forward, dimensions of race, I think that we need to include other dimensions of racism to better understand how lived experiences, with interpersonal racism as well as structural racism can all intersect with one another to shape one's experience with interpersonal and police firearm violence. Also, with exception to one study, racism measures were constructed using place-based and administrative data sets like data from the US Census, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I think there is also added value in incorporating self-report data to assess how, again, the lived experiences of racism interact with the contextual manifestations of racism in neighborhoods to influence firearm violence-related outcomes. And in addition, I'd say another added benefit of utilizing surveys is that researchers have the flexibility to design questions and gather data on racism-related experiences that may not be sufficiently captured in contextual data or even in existing survey instruments. So as shown in this table, Wu and colleagues adapted and modified the index of race-related stress to measure cultural racism for Asian Americans. And prior to this adaptation, I'm not aware of other survey instruments that captured cultural racism for Asian Americans. And now lastly, 15 of the 17 studies in our scoping review were cross-sectional studies, and I know there are many benefits associated with having longitudinal data. But one of the benefits that I'm particularly excited about is the prospect of evaluating mechanisms from racism to firearm violence by adopting a life course perspective. And I think that, applying this perspective is important given, again, this notable increase in racial disparities for firearm homicides as youth transition from early to mid-adolescence. So for example, here, the figure got me wondering, how structural racism and its consequences like neighborhood physical disorder or limited access to healthcare might shape psychological, social, and developmental transitions from childhood to adolescence to produce these very pronounced racial disparities in interpersonal firearm violence during mid-adolescence and even up to adulthood. And moreover, firearm homicide rates have remained quite elevated for Blacks and Hispanics, even into middle adulthood. And so this also got me thinking about how the prolonged exposure of the different forms of racism and its associated consequences may contribute to these racial disparities during middle adulthood. So going forward, I think leveraging longitudinal data, both at the contextual level, but also at the individual level, can provide insights into just these developmental transitions and how racism shapes that and contributes to racial disparities in firearm violence. So I want to thank my colleagues here at the University of Michigan's Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention and folks at School of Public Health and my colleagues at Tulane and also my colleague at NYU for being very active during all phases of this project and for providing guidance when needed. All right, thanks for listening.